This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that only looks stable because it has not been forced to say no out loud yet. And when that system finally does say no, it doesn't sound like drama. It sounds like procedure, votes, deadlines, quiet sentences with sharp edges. Here is the danger. Power can become habit. Not seized in one night, but practiced in public until nobody remembers what permission used to mean. If you've ever assumed the guardrails are automatic, stay with me. Because what's happening right now is a stress test of whether law is real or decorative. And once the machinery learns it can move without consent, it doesn't unlearn it. It just accelerates. So let's start with the moment the system flinched. And what made it flinch in the first place? For the first time in this presidency, the fight is not coming from the other side. It's coming from inside the building. Not whispers, not anonymous leaks. A visible, recorded act that says there are limits and you don't get to ignore them just because you want to. Here's the reframing you have to hold on to. The system is not being driven by ideology right now. It's being driven by tools, legal tools, emergency tools, military tools, oversight tools, the kinds of tools that don't feel dramatic until they're the only thing left between impulse and action. And the question underneath all of this is brutally simple. Who controls those tools when a president treats loyalty as the operating system? Because once a presidency starts testing whether it can act first and justify later, Congress has two choices: reassert itself or become stage dressing. And in this story, even the people who usually protect the president are starting to see the trap. Now, let me show you what changed slowly enough that most people didn't notice it changing at all. There was a time when certain ideas stayed inside the walls. They lived in draft memos, in contingency folders, in the private language of people who understand that saying a thing out loud can make it real. And then, quietly, the boundary moved. Now, the most consequential signals are not delivered as policy. They're delivered as suggestion, as floating, as repeated public talk of options that used to be unthinkable until repetition makes them feel normal, even to the people paid to fear them. Before, the threat of force was supposed to be a last resort, anchored to alliances, treaties, and the slow friction of consent. Now, force gets discussed like leverage, like territory, like a deal you can pressure into existence. And here's the part that should unsettle you. When a president frames military action as a real option, the machinery does not wait for a formal order. Plans get drafted. Allies start hedging. Markets start pricing in risk. Institutions start moving because they have to. That's the silent shift. Not one explosion, a new baseline. And then the system tried to slam the brakes. Last week, Republican senators joined Democrats to advance a war powers resolution. That sounds procedural. It sounds like C-SPAN paperwork, but it's a constitutional flair. Because a war powers resolution is Congress reaching for the one tool designed for exactly this scenario: a president hinting at military force without asking permission first. It is lawmakers saying, in plain legislative language, you do not get to start wars alone. And why did they do it? Because the president has been openly, publicly, repeatedly suggesting military action against Greenland, not as a joke, not as negotiating theater, as a real option. Greenland is not an empty map. Greenland belongs to Denmark. Denmark is a founding NATO ally. And NATO is built on collective defense. An attack on one is treated as an attack on all. So when an American president talks about military action against allied territory, it's not just tough talk, it's a test. Will Congress treat this as rhetoric or as the first step of a machine already turning? If that machine keeps turning, this is where it goes next. Here's the mechanism that makes this so dangerous. Once you normalize the idea that one person can point the country toward conflict by sheer force of will, the argument is no longer about the conflict. It becomes about permission. The War Powers Act exists because presidents, for decades, dragged the country into fights without Congress approving them first. After Vietnam, Lawmakers watched executive decisions bypass democratic debate and swallow lives. So Congress built a brake. Consult us, get authorization, or stop. That brake is what you just watched lawmakers reach for. Now, add the part people miss when they treat this like cable news drama. Greenland is not just Danish territory on paper. It's home to Thule Air Base, one of the most critical pieces of America's missile defense network. That presence exists through cooperation, not conquest. Alliance, not occupation. So when military options get floated, allies don't hear strategy, they hear threat. Congress doesn't hear negotiation. It hears a president testing whether constitutional limits are real. And when a leader treats limits as betrayal, you learn why limits matter. Now, while everyone stared at war powers, another lever got pulled. Then came the second jolt. Faster, quieter, and in some ways, more revealing. While the war powers fight grabbed attention, the president declared a national emergency over Venezuelan oil assets. On paper, it sounds clean, secure energy, protect interests, act decisively. But emergencies don't just act. They concentrate, they centralize, they bypass debate. And this wasn't declared during an acute crisis. It landed during a political firestorm right when Congress was trying to reassert control on war powers, right when oversight questions were tightening, right when the story was turning into a question about limits. Here's what matters. Each emergency lowers the threshold for the next one. Each declaration widens the zone where Congress becomes optional. Border wall funding, COVID responses, trade restrictions, and now this. And the trap Republicans are starting to recognize is brutal. Once you normalize unilateral power, it doesn't disappear when your party loses. It gets inherited. So while lawmakers argue about one dramatic threat, the deeper shift is happening through paperwork and precedent. And then the third front, accountability, started bleeding through. Now, I want to bring this down to where you live, not as a metaphor, as math. Because when power concentrates and oversight fails, the damage doesn't arrive as a constitutional lecture. It arrives as instability, quiet at first, then everywhere. You were promised economic security and no new wars. That promise is now colliding with rhetoric that starts to sound like war planning. While inflation stays stubbornly high and grocery bills don't feel lighter, people don't separate foreign policy from kitchen table economics. They feel the connection in their retirement accounts and their rent. And if Congress keeps getting bypassed through war threats on one side and emergency declarations on the other, then your voice gets bypassed with it. Because your vote is supposed to route power through institutions, not around them. So when you see lawmakers asking why disclosures haven't happened, why Inspector General reviews have stalled, why deadlines are being missed, don't treat that as inside baseball. That's the only paper trail that proves the system still answers to rules. If you want the next part of this story, stay here. Subscribe, because now it goes global. Internationally, this doesn't read as a quirky American political fight. It reads as a structural warning. NATO is not a vibe, it's a promise. And it runs on trust. Trust that the United States will not threaten allied territory. Trust that collective defense means something. Trust that commitments are not negotiable moods. The input gives you the number that should snap your attention into focus. NATO's Article 5 has been invoked exactly once in the alliance's history after September 11th, when Europe stood with America. That is the core memory of the modern alliance. So imagine what happens if the United States is perceived as threatening a NATO member. Unity collapses, European defense cooperation deteriorates, intelligence sharing built entirely on confidence gets jeopardized. And when that trust erodes, it doesn't just make allies nervous, it creates openings. Russia, China, Iran, these aren't abstract villains in a script. They're states that exploit institutional fractures, they seize propaganda victories, they pressure weaker partners. They move into vacuums, and the vacuum forms when American power looks like instinct instead of law. So the world starts planning for a different America, quietly, methodically, and you don't get to see it until it's already expensive. Now comes the part nobody wants to say out loud. What happens next at home? So let's talk about the acceleration phase, because this is where systems stop bending and start transforming. In the next 30 to 90 days, The resistance you saw Republicans joining Democrats on war powers doesn't automatically fade. That vote was procedural, yes, but it signaled something deeper. Lawmakers willing to risk retaliation to defend institutional limits. More oversight is coming. More questions about emergency declarations. More pressure on the stalled disclosures. More scrutiny of why Inspector General processes aren't delivering what was promised. And the countermove is predictable because it's already described in your input. When oversight pressure increases, the spectacle escalates. War threats get louder. Emergencies multiply. The news cycle floods. Everyone scrambles. And accountability gets buried. But here's the point that keeps this unresolved. Once lawmakers cross the line and defy a loyalty demand, crossing back doesn't protect them. It only shows weakness. They've already taken the call. They've already faced the threats. So you get a standoff. Congress testing limits. The presidency testing whether limits can be mocked into irrelevance. And the system does not like standoffs. It forces outcomes. Now I'm going to give you the three futures this system is steering toward without pretending we know which one wins. There are three paths from here, not three predictions, three trajectories. And you can feel the system sliding between them in real time. 1, adjustment. Congress maintains discipline. War powers enforcement becomes real, not symbolic. Emergency declarations meet sustained oversight. The stalled disclosures and Inspector General processes get forced back onto timelines. The presidency learns that no is a working word again. The machine slows. Not because anyone becomes virtuous, because the structure holds. 2, erosion. The pushback flickers, then fragments. Every new controversy dilutes attention. Emergencies become routine. Oversight requests become noise. Law still exists, but it's treated like decor invoked when convenient, ignored when costly. The presidency doesn't need to abolish limits. It just needs to outlast them. 3, rupture. The war power threat against allied territories stops being hypothetical. NATO trust breaks in a way that can't be patched quickly. Markets price in governance risk as permanent. Congress escalates. The presidency escalates back, loyalty demanded, dissent punished, institutions shoved into open conflict. I'm not going to tell you which one happens. The input doesn't allow fortune telling, but I will tell you this. All three paths begin with the same question, whether power still needs permission. And that brings us to the ending we don't get to enjoy.